The first snow came early that year, drifting across the wooden barracks like a silent warning. Camp Roberts was quiet. Too quiet for a place holding over 200 Japanese prisoners of war. The wind whistled through the barbed wire fences, past the guard towers, across the frost-covered logs stacked by the gate. To the men inside, it might as well have been the edge of the world. Private Hiroshi Nakamura stood barefoot on the plank floor, watching his breath rise in soft clouds. He didn't speak. None of them did that morning. There was an unspoken truth among them: death would come soon. They had been captured in Guam, transported across the sea like cargo, dropped into a strange land where everything was foreign. The smells, the sky, even the silence. And now this snow, pure white, like the funeral robes of a Shinto priest. Back home, Nakamura had been a fisherman's son. He had never seen snow in his life. The barracks door creaked open. Cold rushed in. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, tall and wide, wrapped in a heavy coat, boots pounding on the wooden floor. "Let's move," the man said in slow, deliberate English. "All of you, outside, now." They didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. "Obey. Outside." The men lined up, teeth chattering, shoulders hunched. There were no chains, no shouting, just an eerie kind of order. They had been told that Americans were cruel, that surrender meant shame, that they would be tortured or used for experiments. But so far, none of that had happened. One by one, they were handed gloves, thick coats, and strange-looking boots. The clothing was warm. Too warm. Suspiciously generous. Nakamura slipped his hands into the gloves and blinked at the man standing before him. The American's name, stitched into his coat, read Jenkins. "Roy Jenkins," the man said, tapping his chest. "Roy." Nakamura didn't respond. The Americans led them toward the forest. Behind the camp, thick pines stood like giants, their branches heavy with snow. In the clearing, dozens of axes leaned against logs, and several two-man saws were buried in the snow. The prisoners looked at one another. Was this some kind of punishment? "Today," Jenkins said, "you learn how to cut trees." A few men shifted uneasily. One muttered something about forced labor. Another whispered that this was just a trick before execution. Nakamura said nothing. He stepped forward, picked up an axe, and stared at the frozen bark of a pine. He hadn't been trained to cut wood. He had been trained to die, but the Americans didn't rush them. They explained the tools, the angles, the way to hold the axe. They demonstrated everything. Jenkins even laughed when one of the younger prisoners dropped his blade in the snow. "Easy, easy," Jenkins said, lifting the axe. "You'll get it." By midday, the forest echoed with the rhythmic sound of chopping. The prisoners worked in pairs, sawing through thick trunks, stacking logs, wiping sweat from their brows despite the cold. There was something almost peaceful about it. Honest work. No guns. No shouting. No war. That night, back in the barracks, the men spoke for the first time in weeks. Quiet voices. Careful tones. They didn't beat us. They fed us. They gave us warm clothes. Nakamura sat silently, staring at the floor. He didn't know what to make of it. Over the next days, the routine continued. Wake up. Chop wood. Stack logs. Drink hot coffee bitter, unfamiliar but warm. The Americans taught them new words. Axe, log, snow. The prisoners repeated them quietly, testing the sounds like children. One evening, after a long day in the forest, Jenkins sat with them beside the fire pit. He passed around a tin of tobacco, not forcing it on them, just offering. Most declined. Nakamura, curious, took a small pinch, imitating Jenkins. "You speak English?" Jenkins asked him. Nakamura hesitated, then nodded slightly. "A little." Jenkins grinned. Good. Maybe you can help me teach the others. And just like that, Nakamura became a bridge. He started translating simple commands, then questions, then names. The Americans were patient. They joked. They shared stories about their wives, their dogs, their farms. One guard had a son in the Navy, stationed in the Pacific. He didn't seem to blame the Japanese for it. One morning, Nakamura found a folded piece of paper under his pillow. A drawing, crude but clear. A tree, a cabin, and a man smiling beside a fire. Below it, a note in shaky Japanese. You're not my enemy anymore. He never found out who drew it. As the days passed, the fear began to fade. The prisoners stopped whispering about execution. They started talking about home, about what they would do after the war, about the possibility remote, impossible even that, maybe they could go on living. And then came the news. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The camp went silent again. Jenkins didn't speak that morning. No one did. Nakamura stood with the others, listening to the static-laced radio broadcast. The words were strange, foreign, but the tone was unmistakable. Japan had fallen. Everything they had believed in empire, honor had crumbled in an instant. The rising sun had set, and they were still alive. That night, Nakamura stood outside the barracks, staring up at the Montana sky. Snowflakes drifted down, slow and quiet. In the distance, a coyote howled. Behind him, someone said his name. He turned. Jenkins stood there, hands in his pockets. Hell of a world, isn't it? He said. Nakamura nodded. Double quotes. Do you hate me? Jenkins asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nakamura looked at him for a long time. No, he said softly. I don't think I ever did. The days after the radio broadcast were the heaviest they had ever felt. Inside the camp, the air was thick, not with fear this time, but with something else. Something quieter. Shame, defeat, confusion. The kind that settled deep in the chest and refused to leave. For Nakamura and the others, the idea that the Emperor Tenno Heike himself had spoken directly to the people to announce surrender was unthinkable, unheard of. In all their teachings, all their war briefings, all the stories passed from soldier to soldier, they were told that the Emperor was a god, eternal, distant, above human things like microphones and radios. But now, even he had bowed. For many, the emotional collapse was worse than anything they'd endured on the battlefield. Men who had survived Bataan, Saipan, and Iwo Jima now sat silently on their bunks, eyes hollow, lips unmoving. Some wept without sound. Others clutched faded photographs of mothers, wives, children they might never see again. Nakamura didn't cry, not because he wasn't broken, but because he didn't know how to process what he was feeling. For the first time since boarding that freighter in Guam, he felt truly lost. Not geographically, spiritually. If the Emperor could surrender, then what was all the sacrifice for? What had his comrades died for? What had he survived for? And yet, the Americans didn't gloat. There were no celebrations inside the fences. No taunting. No loud cheers or victory parades. The guards moved with a strange sort of quiet respect, as if they too understood the gravity of what had happened. One morning, Jenkins approached Nakamura outside the mess tent. You okay? He asked. Nakamura didn't answer. He didn't have the words. Jenkins sat beside him on the cold bench, pulling a canteen from his belt and handing it over. You know, Jenkins said after a moment, when I was stationed in France, we used to think you guys were monsters, crazy, fanatics, wouldn't surrender, wouldn't speak, wouldn't even blink sometimes. He chuckled, but it wasn't mocking. And now here you are, just a man, same as me. Nakamura looked at him. There was no anger in Jenkins' voice, no bitterness, just a tired honesty. "Do you think we're still soldiers?" Nakamura asked, his English rough but clear. Jenkins looked at the snow-covered tree line for a long time. "No," he said finally. "I think you're something more important now." The days passed. With no orders from Tokyo and no war left to fight, the camp routine shifted. There was less structure, less urgency. The prisoners were allowed to walk outside the fences under supervision. They were given access to the library. English classes began voluntary, but popular. Nakamura found himself drawn to a book about Montana wildlife. It had drawings of elk, bears, rivers, eagles. He'd never seen such animals in person, but something about their quiet power pulled at him. He started sketching them in the margins of scrap paper, copying the curves of their bodies, the shape of their eyes. One afternoon, Jenkins saw the drawings. "These are damn good," he said, holding them up. "You ever think about doing this for real? After the war?" Nakamura shrugged. "I don't know. If I have an after." Jenkins didn't push. But he didn't stop encouraging either. Soon, other prisoners joined Nakamura in drawing. One carved a bear from a block of wood. Another painted a mural on the inside of the mess hall wall Mount Fuji behind a Montana valley. A fusion of two worlds that had once tried to destroy each other. Then came the day that changed everything. A truck arrived from town, driven by a rancher named Thomas Whitaker. He was older, built like an ox, with a Stetson hat and skin like cured leather. He was there to pick up firewood the prisoners had chopped, part of an agreement with the army. But when he saw the mural inside the mess hall, he stopped in his tracks. "Who painted that?" he asked. Nakamura stepped forward, cautious. "I did." "With help." Whitaker looked him up and down, then grunted. "You ever ride a horse?" The question was so unexpected, Nakamura thought he had misheard. "No," he replied. "Well, that's about to change." The following week, a group of prisoners carefully vetted, with spotless behavior records, were brought to Whitaker's ranch under guard. They were allowed to help mend fences, clean stables, haul hay. And then they were shown how to ride. The first time Nakamura climbed onto the back of a chestnut mare, his legs shook. Not from fear, but from the surreal absurdity of it all. A few months ago, he had been digging trenches in Okinawa. Now he was riding a horse under the wide Montana sky. Whitaker barked orders like a drill sergeant, but he wasn't cruel. He taught them balance, posture, how to communicate with the animal through gentle movement. By the end of the second week, Nakamura was galloping across the pasture, wind in his face, snow in his hair, a strange and unfamiliar freedom blooming in his chest. Back at the camp, the stories spread like wildfire. The Americans are letting them ride horses. They're working on real ranches. Some of the older prisoners were skeptical. "It's propaganda," one said. "They're using us." But Nakamura knew it was something else. Something deeper. The Americans were trying to show them that even enemies could find common ground. He started keeping a journal. In it, he wrote not about the war, but about Montana. The colors of the sky at sunset. The smell of pine. The way the horses moved with silent intelligence. "I thought I would die in shame," he wrote in one entry. "But instead, I have learned how to live in silence." In another, he described Jenkins laughing with one of the guards after slipping on an icy path. "I used to think laughter was a weakness," Nakamura wrote. "Now I see it as a form of strength." Months passed. Spring crept in. The snow melted. The fences stayed, but they felt softer now. Symbolic more than literal. Then one morning, a new order came from Washington. Repatriation. The war was truly over. It was time to go home. Packing was quiet. There was no music, no singing, no victory chants. Just the soft rustle of paper, the clinking of metal bowls, a careful folding of worn clothing. Nakamura sat on his cot, staring at a pair of worn leather gloves Whitaker had given him. They were too big for his hands, thick and cracked, with the smell of horses and hay still embedded deep in the seams. He didn't pack them. He held them. Around him, others moved with the same uncertainty. Where were they going? Yes, home, technically. But what was home now? Japan wasn't the same as it had been before the war. And neither were they. Even Jenkins, who had become a constant presence at Nakamura's side, looked conflicted as he read the orders aloud. Tomorrow, we begin transport to Seattle. From there, a ship to Yokohama. Yokohama. The name felt foreign on Nakamura's tongue now. The night before departure, the prisoners were allowed a farewell gathering. There was no alcohol, but there was tea. American too sweet, not strong enough. And there were biscuits, soft and crumbling. A projector played old black and white films on a sheet hung across the mess hall wall. Charlie Chaplin. Harold Lloyd. The kind of slapstick comedy that once would have made Nakamura scoff. But that night, he laughed. Not because it was especially funny, but because it felt human. And in that moment, humanity felt like a precious, fragile thing worth clinging to. Whitaker came in just before lights out. He didn't say much, just walked through the rows of bunks, nodding. When he reached Nakamura, he handed him something small and heavy wrapped in brown cloth. "Open it when you're ready," he said. Nakamura nodded. He didn't open it that night. The journey to Seattle was long and cold. Train cars rattled through snow-dusted valleys and open plains. American civilians gathered at small-town stations to watch the enemy soldiers pass by. Some waved. Some scowled. One old woman pressed her hand to the glass, mouthing words Nakamura couldn't hear. Her eyes were kind. On the ship, the men were silent. No one sang. No one celebrated. They stood along the rails, watching the American coastline shrink into the horizon, its forests, its towns, its wild, open skies. Nakamura stood among them. His hands in the coat pockets Jenkins had insisted he take. "You'll need something warm," Jenkins had said, forcing it into his arms before they parted. "Winter's not done with you yet." Nakamura didn't know whether to smile or cry. 3 weeks later, they docked in Yokohama. The harbor was in ruins. American bombers had done their work. Factories were skeletons. Warehouses burned out shells. The air stank of smoke, rust, and rot. Nakamura stepped off the gangplank into a city that felt unfamiliar, not just because of the destruction, but because he had changed. He wandered through the broken streets, past hollow-eyed children and women selling what little they had. His family home had vanished. A crater stood where the gate once was. He found shelter with an uncle, who said little but offered a bowl of rice and a futon. That night, Nakamura opened the brown cloth Whitaker had given him. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Nakamura on horseback. Mid-gallop, a huge grin plastered across his face as snow kicked up around him. Behind him, the Montana mountains loomed like sentinels. Tucked into the corner was a small note, scribbled in Whitaker's rough handwriting. "You're more than a soldier now. Don't forget it." He did single quotes T. Over the next year. Nakamura tried to rebuild. He worked odd jobs, cleaned floors, hauled bricks. He painted first in secret, then publicly. His sketches of Montana horses, rivers, pine trees, Jenkins' crooked smile began to attract attention. One day, a gallery owner stopped him in the market. "Did you draw this?" he asked, holding up a folded newspaper. Nakamura nodded. "I'd like to show your work," the man said, and so it began. His first exhibition was small. Just a few paintings. But the room was full. Some people came out of curiosity. What kind of art would a former POW create? Others came for the novelty. But many left in silence, moved by the strange juxtaposition of Japanese technique and American wilderness. 1. Piece in particular drew the most attention. It was titled, Forgiveness in the Snow. It showed two men standing in a Montana, pasture, one in uniform, one in flannel. A horse between them. No faces, just posture. Open hands. Mutual respect. The painting was purchased by an American veteran visiting Tokyo on business. He had served in the Pacific and said the painting helped him sleep for the first time in years. Nakamura began teaching art to children. He told them about color, composition, shadow. But he also told them about Montana. About cold mornings and warm fires. About horses that listened without judgment. About a man named Jenkins who had once said, "You're something more important now." And when the children asked, "Were they kind to you?" he always paused. Then he would answer, "Some were." And it was enough. Years later, when Nakamura was an old man with white hair and ink-stained fingers, he received a letter. The envelope was thick, the handwriting familiar, but shakier now. Inside was a photograph. It showed a young man 20, maybe 21, standing on the porch of a ranch house, holding a newborn foal in his arms. On the back, in the same rough hand, "My grandson. Thought you'd want to meet him." There was no signature. There didn't need to be one. Nakamura smiled. He picked up a brush, dipped it into ink, and began to paint. Not war. Not pain, but peace.